We have sitting at the table here another amazing panel, and they have all agreed to come and present on something that's really hot in public policy terms that we need to be paying attention to. In some cases, it's an update. In some cases, it's a call to action. We have asked them all to come and to speak for 10 minutes. With no further ado, I'm going to start over here with Derrick Corrigan. Derrick, it's your 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie. And first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. It's so nice to be in a room of progressive politicians, to be able to talk about the important issues that we all face in our communities. I want to first bring greetings from Burnaby City Council, from all of my colleagues, both on council and on school board, and from my organization. As many of you know, the Burnaby Citizens Association, over the course of many years, as an NDP-affiliated organization, has been the government in Burnaby. We now are at 30 years consecutive, which is a tremendous record, and the most successful municipal government organization anywhere in Canada and probably anywhere in North America. We continue to be very proud that Burnaby keeps re-electing us as we practice progressive policy in our city. But even when you're a good government and you work very hard to try to make things better for your citizens, there are issues that all of us have to face that have serious implications. And many of you have probably followed the fight that we've been having with Kinder Morgan over a period of time, certainly starting back in about 2013. Now, we just lost, by the way, another decision in the BC Court of Appeal. And having lost another decision, you know, it's I think our third loss in the British Columbia Supreme Court and the BC Court of Appeal, is that we've now decided that it's time to give up. Kinder Morgan has offered us $5 million for the city, and they've offered us, no, there's a good reason, is that they've offered us $500,000 for the BCA for the next election. And we feel that we're going to be capable of buying our way out of our own hypocrisy with that kind of money. And I thought that today was the perfect day to announce that change of policy, because today's date is so special to all of us. I think that everyone owes it on April the 1st to do something that indicates that all of us have a sense of humor about what we're facing in our communities. Now, of course, none of that's true. The reality is that we have been absolutely unstoppable in this fight against Kinder Morgan. We have, throughout the time that they first made this application, opposed Kinder Morgan with everything that the city has. Luckily, we've got a lot, as we are one of the most successful cities financially anywhere in Canada, with absolutely no debt and $1 billion in reserves that we've developed over a period of 30 years. Our strength as a city has allowed us to be able to stand up against a multinational corporation in a very effective way. But we haven't asked our taxpayers to fund that, because we have a casino in Burnaby that we get 10% of the money from, the profit from. And so all of the money that we've been using to defend ourselves against Kinder Morgan has been paid for by the people who gamble at the casino. So that's been a great contribution by all of those people. So when you lose money, you can remember at our casino, you're helping to fight Kinder Morgan. Now, I told you that we had just lost another hearing in the BC Court of Appeal. And it's a fascinating situation that we've been put into in this battle that we've been conducting in the courts in regard to Kinder Morgan, because no one has done this before. No one has stepped up and taken on one of these multinational corporations and an agency of the federal government in the way that we have. And it's caused real consternation on the part of the courts, because we keep going in and arguing that in modern society, local governments have a much greater responsibility than they have ever had in the past, and that people turn to their local governments for representation of issues that impact them in their daily lives. And yet, on a constitutional basis, there is absolutely no recognition of the status of local government, of municipal government. We are simply, as they say, a creature of statute. That means that everything that we do is controlled by the provincial government, and the federal government can step on any of the choices that we make with impunity. Now, here we are in a situation, and I've argued this, and our council's argued it in the Supreme Court, is that we are now basing 21st century decisions on a 19th century set of laws developed in the British North America Act. A set of laws that were developed in colonial Canada at a time when, in fact, very few people lived in any of the provinces. In places like British Columbia, very few people lived here. And as a result, they formed regional governments, provincial governments. And they did the same thing in the United States, in Australia. In all the colonized areas, they developed these provincial relationships and then divided power between a federal government and the provincial governments. This isn't what happens in other places in the world. For instance, in Europe, where they have unitary forms of government, where the federal government is very powerful, but there are relatively no provincial or state governments, and cities have a direct relationship with the federal government, you have significantly more power to represent the interests of your local citizens, and the federal government has an obligation to consider the interests of cities. In fact, in places like Sweden, all of the taxes are collected by local government and then distributed to the federal government and to the regional government. It shows you a completely different set of beliefs in Europe from those which we have in colonial North America and Australia. Now, oftentimes I think all of us, when we look at these issues and we look at the impact of these issues, we tend to say, well, we can't do anything about this. And that's what they told First Nations, that they couldn't do anything about it. But First Nations took on this issue of constitutional status and fought it out and were able to attain constitutional status for First Nations in the Constitution when it was repatriated. And now, when people trample on the rights of First Nations, the courts must listen. Their status is such that 100 members of a band have the power to be able to stop a project as a result of having the constitutional status to have a hearing in court. Where in a city like ours, of 250,000 people, we have absolutely no status and they dismiss us out of hand. You only have to have fought one of these battles to learn how little respect municipalities get within our court system. We found that out the hard way. But we continue to press on, and we refuse to allow that to stop us from ensuring that we're representing the best interests of our citizens. And so even though we've suffered these losses in the Supreme Court, and our council has told us that it's unlikely that we'll do any better in the Supreme Court of Canada, and I commend you to have a read of these decisions, because I think if any, they're relatively short and they're easy to understand, because most of it is Burnaby drop dead. You've got absolutely no authority to be able to protect the interests of your citizens against Kinder Morgan going through your conservation area, imposing their will on you, this multinational corporation that has the authority of the National Energy Board is cloaked in the federal government powers, and they can do as they please in relation to the property that people in your community value. After you've been told that a few times, it certainly brings it home to all of us. But we are still proceeding to go on to the Federal Court of Appeal and appeal the decision of the National Energy Board. And we continue to press forward to make that happen. lastly, I want to say to all of you is that we can use help. You know, sometimes it's pretty lonely where we are. And if you've got ideas, if you've got some way that can assist us in being able to represent the interests of our citizens and to stand up to Kinder Morgan, we want you to join with us. We want you to become partners in this effort. We think it's incredibly important for cities, municipalities to stick together in this kind of a battle, and for all of us to show that we will stand together against a company like Kinder Morgan imposing their will on our citizens and our community. So I ask all of you over the next weeks and months to remember Burnaby, to remember that we're standing not only for our own interests, but for your interests too. And that if you can come and assist us in being able to stand up to this multinational corporation, it will not be as easy for them to impose their will on your community. Standing together is the most important thing we can do now, and despite the fact the system is weighed against us, is that I always believe the power of the people is much stronger than any of the laws that they attempt to impose. And the question will become one of whether or not people in our community are prepared to stand up. I, for one, will stand in front of that bulldozer and be arrested as a last resort. I am prepared to sacrifice what has been, over the course of many years, a law-abiding career to ensure that we make it clear that we are not prepared to have this happen to our community. So with that, thank you very much for having
me. I didn't believe him when he said they would give up. Blair, do you want to speak there or here? All right. Blair Redlin, everybody.
Thanks, Charlie. Good morning, everybody. I'm a researcher, and I've been asked to talk about emerging issues regarding international trade agreements. And so I thought I'd propose to do a comprehensive review of the global trading system in the next 10 minutes, especially because it's April 1st. But instead, I just thought I'd touch on a number of the emerging issues and implications related to the long list of trade agreements that people are dealing with and facing right now around the world, but particularly here in Canada. I wanted to focus on four and just touch on some of the current actions and activities regarding them. So first of all, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union, the CETA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada, Mexico, and the United States, the proposed Trade and Services Agreement, which has significant implications for municipalities and which you've probably never heard of, and the proposed Canada-China Free Trade Agreement. So first of all, with regard to CETA, it's been in negotiation and process since 2008. That's some 9 years of negotiation, and despite numerous signing ceremonies and announcements, I can bring you the news that it is still definitely not finished and certainly not a done deal. Here in Canada, the legislation for the CETA has made its way through the House of Commons and is now before the Senate, which is deliberating slowly on it. But in Europe, it's a kind of a different picture. In Europe, the European Parliament approved the CETA in February, but now actual implementation of it moves to the member state level in Europe. And the agreement will be applied provisionally in Europe once it's law in Canada. But that provisional application will not include the very controversial investor-state dispute resolution process, at least not for now, and a number of other aspects which are within the jurisdiction, what the Europeans call the competence, of the member states. And if even one of the 28 member states of the European Union declines to ratify the CETA, then the whole deal fails. And that's why it was so significant, the news that you may have noticed about the position of Wallonia, which is one of the regional governments in Belgium, a number of months ago, because of the way the Constitution works of the federal state of Belgium. The regional governments are actually very significant in that Constitution, and each of the regional governments of Belgium has to approve. And so the position of Wallonia was very significant. So there's been huge pushback against CETA in Europe, with more than 3.5 million signatures on the petitions against it, more than 500,000 on the streets protesting last October. And of interest to local governments here, there are now 2,331 municipalities across Europe that have declared themselves as CETA, and also TTIP, the proposed deal with the United States, CETA and TTIP-free zones. Those municipalities in Europe represent more than 75 million residents. And this wave of local government opposition actually began here in BC. It actually began in Burnaby, which passed the first resolution asking to be exempt from CETA several years ago. And that helped to motivate and encourage a number of other municipalities in Canada, so that eventually more than 50 municipalities in Canada passed similar motions asking that the local government sector be exempted from CETA. Municipalities as big as Toronto, Victoria, Montreal, as small as Trail, Hamilton, many more across the country. And this action in Canada in turn inspired the Europeans to do the same. So the 2,300 municipalities in Europe have formed an organization now. They followed up with 3 large conferences of the local government sector in Europe, one in Barcelona, another in Brussels, and in February in Grenoble. They've issued a number of declarations, and they've developed a coordinated municipal network to continue their concern about what they're calling the new generation of trade agreements. Meanwhile, what about the fate of CETA itself? 2/3 of the signatures have been gathered in the Netherlands to force a national referendum in Holland on CETA. There's a review going on by the European Court of Justice that Wallonia and Belgium had insisted on. There's a likely constitutional challenge coming from France. There's very strong opposition in Germany and Austria and Belgium. And so CETA is many years away from actually being fully implemented, or perhaps being implemented at all. Second trade deal, NAFTA. I have 2 words for you: Donald Trump. You're all aware that NAFTA renegotiations commence soon. And I just wanted to flag that procurement issues will be significant. As the U.S. has indicated, they want greater expansion of their Buy America rules, while at the same time restricting public procurement practices in Mexico and Canada. So that will be of interest to municipalities. Agricultural supply management is again under threat, and there may be linkages made between the softwood lumber agreement, which is yet again up for renegotiation, and issues like agricultural supply management. Third deal I wanted to just canvass was the proposed trade and services agreement. You may not have heard of it, but it's potentially very significant for municipalities, since it deals with services that local governments both supply and regulate. There is a strong deregulatory emphasis in the TISA. Think, for example, of zoning that municipalities deal with, and a requirement that regulations, including at the local government level, be, and I'm quoting here, no more burdensome than necessary. Plus the so-called ratchet and standstill clauses, which make it very difficult to bring contracted or privatized services back in-house. No requirement that you contract out, but once you do, the provisions of TISA will make it very challenging to bring things back in-house. So there's detailed leaked text and analysis of the TISA available via WikiLeaks. The talks have slowed a bit lately while the United States gets its new trade staff and agenda together. So now would be a good time for local councils to ask the federal government and your staff for briefings about the potential implications for the municipal and Indigenous government sectors in Canada. I only have 10 minutes, as I noted, so I won't go into those numerous implications, but there's a lot of analysis that's online now that your staff can take a look at, and that the federal government should be in a position to brief you about. And I think it's a significant issue around which there's been no consultation, which is a significant issue with regard to the Indigenous communities, I think, in Canada, because this will have implications for them as well. And interestingly, the government of New Zealand is party to these talks. They insisted that something called the Treaty of Waitangi be referenced in the deal, and that exemptions be put in place to ensure that the protections of this founding treaty of New Zealand between the colonial government and the Maori there be taken account of in the TISA. In contrast, in Canada, there's been absolutely no engagement, consultation with First Nations, and let alone any attempt in the negotiations to try and ensure that our constitutional provisions are protected from it. Finally, I wanted to mention the Canada-China, the proposed Canada-China Free Trade Agreement, a deal with obviously huge implications. Canada is formally consulting about it now, so it would probably be an important time to provide municipal feedback early in the process. China has said it wants full and complete access to the Canadian economy, which means local procurement as well. And that's a preliminary bargaining position which is very reminiscent to the position that the European Union took with regard to the CETA. The Chinese are also interested in Chinese corporations being able to bring their own workforces with them for projects here in Canada. There was a lot of public concern raised about the Canada-China Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, the so-called FIPA, during the Harper years. And it went ahead nonetheless. There was a constitutional challenge from Brenda Sayers on behalf of the, I have to pronounce the name of the First Nation near Port Alberni. It begins with H. But, and a lot of other concerns raised about the FIPA. I think people should devote a similar amount of attention to the proposal for a big, comprehensive free trading agreement with China. So it will be interesting to see if the Canadian public reaction, interesting to see what the Canadian reaction will be to a proposal for a full-fledged trade and investment agreement with China. And so with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Blair. I think you made very good use of your 10 minutes. That was great. Thank you. Adrienne Montani, you're next.
Thank you. Hi, for those who don't know me, I'm Adrienne Montani with First Call, BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition, and also First Call is part of the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition, so that's who I'm speaking on behalf of today. And at first I thought this was called the Emerging Issues Panel, and I wanted to start from a kind of oppositional point of view. This is not an emerging issue. It's been around a very long time. I've done some slides just because I have to talk a little bit about numbers just to give you a bit of the picture about poverty. So it's not because I love PowerPoint, but because it gives you something quickly to see numbers. Started with still 1 in 5 children are poor. We publish a child poverty report card every year, and the Poverty Reduction Coalition looks at all groups who are in poverty as well. So just a quick visual there that, sorry, I have to find the clicker here. But we know that systems create the results they're trying to achieve. So just think about that. We have a system that creates very high levels of poverty, and that's what we're getting. So we have a system that's getting what it wants to get. So that's what we're always questioning, is the system that creates this. So 1 in 5 children are poor, and that's about 163,000 children. So that would be bigger than the city of Abbotsford. I thought for this audience maybe that would resonate. So that's a lot of kids. And we know that the system that creates this is not accidental. It's about rising inequality. So poverty is a symptom or an outcome of rising inequality. Been emerging from, it's the direct result of neoliberal and global capitalism juggernaut. The current system, as I said, is designed to get the results of low wages, suppressing wages, insecure work, weakened social safety net, which leads to desperation and deprivation for some, piles of debt for others to try and stay afloat, while wealth accumulates in the hands of the few, or the 1%. So that's the system we're in, and it's not getting better over time. We benchmark it from 1989, which is when the House of Commons made an all-party resolution, the first of several, to end child poverty. They said they would end it by the year 2000, way missed the mark, but that's what we benchmark from them. So you can see we've been continuing to have a higher rate than we did 25 years ago. So we are not making progress on that, despite what you might hear from the provincial government at this point running around citing some very carefully cherry-picked stats on how child poverty has gotten better in BC. So it's clear that in this circumstance we need a child poverty, or a poverty reduction plan with legislated goals and timelines if we want to make a systemic difference. So a quick few more stats just to give you the depth and the range of the issue here. For BC's worse than the Canadian average overall. The first bars there show that we have an overall poverty rate bigger than the national average, or deeper or higher. The child poverty rate's worse than the national average. And for young children under 6, which is that time when early childhood development, early brain development, some of the biggest impacts of living in child poverty or living in poverty have lifelong impacts, we also have a higher rate. And if you think about that children's poverty is higher than the overall child poverty rate, and that very young children's poverty rates are higher than even the overall child poverty rate. So that hierarchy there of who's most poor tells us again of the systemic issues that we don't support young families in raising children well, and those are that's what we should be addressing. Within those overall stats, there's some overrepresentation of particular groups. 1 in every 2 children living with a single parent in this province is poor, 50%. And most of those are female-led families, 80-some-odd% of those are female. So this is a gendered issue as well. So we have women's poverty deeply entrenched if they're single parents and for their children. 1/3 of recent immigrants are poor. Almost half of youth who age out of foster care at the age of 19 end up on income assistance within the first 6 months or so after leaving. So there's another systemic way we just drop kids off a cliff. Some of the most vulnerable kids making that transition, very difficult transition to adulthood, and we say, there you go, take your $610 a month. In Surrey, I use this stat, but Aboriginal, Indigenous kids are way overrepresented. This is from a Surrey report and national statistics, but just to see the over 2.5 times the child poverty rate for Indigenous kids as compared to non-Indigenous. So these again point to this. It's not because of a moral failure of any of these groups of people or a lack of energy to go to work or work initiative. This is because we have a system that is designed to disadvantage them, trap them in poverty, place barriers in their way. And yet, what we do in the dialogue often, and certainly the neoliberal dialogue, is to blame and stigmatize the individuals who are in these groups and say it must be their fault. So we always have to counter that. Families, often when you hear poverty and child poverty, you think families on income assistance. They make up a minority of the families on income assistance. And most poor kids, and in fact most poor people, work. So again, we're talking working poverty. You can see how family incomes are falling behind the rising costs of living, and particularly with some of the costs like childcare and housing, probably not a surprise to anyone in this room, going way up beyond wages and income. We have lots of low-income folks in the province. And so, of course, the solutions that come to mind are higher minimum wages, and we certainly work on that. Living wages, we host the Living Wage for Families campaign, stronger employment standards, so that and defending trade union rights, because vulnerable workers are fearful of asserting their rights and end up in these terrible jobs and scary situations. Those who are on income assistance are in some of the deepest poverty. Welfare rates overall have not gone up for about 10 years now. You can see the poverty gap. So for a model family of 4 with 2 kids, they're almost $14,000 below the poverty line. So we're talking very deep poverty here. And again, this is an overwhelming story of women's poverty, because over 80% of the children on income assistance are in lone parent families, mostly led by women, and the majority of these people are on disability assistance or have some other reason why they can't work. But again, we often blame them and say they should somehow just pull up their bootstraps. So when BC tries to do something, what our province has a pattern over the last couple of decades of what I would call fairy dust funding. We'll do a little bit and we'll say we're doing a lot. I just wanted to show you a quick comparison of Child benefits. I'll talk in a minute about the national child benefit. That's one of the better pieces of public policy. But at the provincial level, we have child benefits. And BC's is relatively new since 2015. But it's the only one of all the provinces that have one that only covers your children until they turn 6. Whereas other provinces take the whole span of childhood into account. And if you compare BC's rate of $660 a year, which was touted as a child care affordability, wouldn't pay for 1 month of child care, it's not an affordability measure. When you compare it to Quebec, Ontario, Quebec is almost 4 times what we give, and again, for the full lifespan or full childhood. So we can do so much better. We have very weak and poor policy, and they shouldn't be given a lot of credit for that, for a very late coming and very small contribution. So I wanted to go back quickly to income inequality. This is, again, just family income. It would look the same, or probably maybe even more drastic if we looked at overall inequality. But for family, the family pie is divided up very unequally. The richest 10% of families take home over a quarter of the pie, and the poorest half of families take home a quarter of the pie. So the 75% goes to the upper half. The income growth for the richest 10% of families was, over the last 25 years, as a chart in our report card that looks at this, was a 49% growth in that 25 years. But for the poorest 10%, only an 8% growth. So again, I just want to emphasize this is not only income inequality existing, it continues to grow. The gap between the top and the bottom families, and again, this is just income, is 13-1. We have the highest income inequality of all provinces in family income. And again, it would be much worse if we included wealth, as I'm sure you've heard from Seth at CCPA and many other, Niklika and others. If you add wealth in here, this pie gets even more unequal. And the impacts of this inequality are, of course, things we're seeing in our cities all over the place. Homelessness. You can see this is the Vancouver homeless count going up to 2016, so you can see the rise in total homelessness and sheltered homelessness. So now we have a whole bunch of shelters that help people, but they don't have homes. And you can see hunger and food insecurity is another major outcome for children, but also for lots of other parts of the population. And we know that from the research on inequality, that this has profound impacts on both individual health and on the health of societies and our communities. And what's left of our democracy, I would say. Because money now buys political power and further privilege for the wealthy at the expense of fairness in tax policy and an adequate social safety net. So this is a recipe, as many of you, I'm sure, have seen some of this research, for a very sick society to have continuing growing inequality. We'll have higher rates, and it is predicted, and there's a gradient that matches this. The higher the gap between the rich and the poor, the sicker your society, with things like higher rates of addiction, higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of violence, higher rates of mental illness, poor social mobility, higher rates of ill health and health costs, lack of trust, social cohesion goes down the tube. So all of the things that make society healthy start to recede, and all the things that we would see as symptoms of a sick society start to grow, and those are directly related to income inequality. So we have what I've been showing is we have a poverty creation plan. That's what our system produces, and that's what we are getting. And these are conscious political choices at very senior levels of government, but pretty much throughout our society, a lot of our policy is creating this inequality, and that's what we need. We need a poverty reduction plan, not a poverty creation plan. And these are the pillars we'd like to see. I've mentioned some of them already, but obviously we need to bring wages up. Those who can't work need income assistance that they can live on. We need, obviously, affordable housing, childcare, so that both people can work and children can have good care and learning environments. The health pillar there. We need community health, long-term care for seniors, etc. Education is a pillar that's been underfunded. It's crucial to creating an equal society so that people are able to participate and see themselves as participants and civic actors as opposed to just consumers, and to focus, if we are able to, as we put in place measures in a poverty reduction plan, make sure that it addresses that we bring those overrepresented groups that I mentioned earlier along with us, so we don't just say some people can get ahead, that those who are most overrepresented. Did I miss a day? Sorry, okay, I'm about done. So we know we can afford this. Again, CCPA research on this. And we know we need universal and targeted programs. I put some of the solutions there. It costs more to do what we're doing now. Clowns know the solutions. So just, these are Clowns Against Poverty in Victoria. So I'm urging you to take to the streets, set up your own clown group or whatever works for you, but have some fun. But get out there and let people know. We have an election coming up. Make poverty public in this province. Make sure that it's a voting issue, and people know the dangers of allowing growing income inequality to continue to their own health and well-being and to the health of their communities. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Adrienne. Okay, Shirley Ackland, come on up.
Good morning, Just. I'm honored to be here on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. When Charlie first contacted me to ask me to join this participation on this panel, I wondered what first-term, small-town, northern Vancouver Island resource community could possibly bring to the conversation. But then I looked at the date that the panel was going to be here. So if I'm comic relief, I'm afraid I'm sadly lacking, but I'm very happy to be here this morning. And I'm encouraged by what Libby Davis said this morning to talk about what we know. And I moved to Port McNeill in 1979, 1980, a small logging community in northern Vancouver Island, and it was a bustling little community. I grew up in Burnaby, and so I felt very privileged to grow up in what I consider the People's Republic of Burnaby. But work was plentiful when I moved up there. The houses all had a $1 million view. They all look at the ocean. They're just spectacular. It was affordable living, not just for single people, but for families. And it was bustling with young families. We actually, in the time I was living there, when my children were young, they had to build another school because people were moving to the communities. There were good schools, a medical clinic. Actually, Port McNeill Medical Clinic, Dr. Granger Avery started that clinic, and he is the Canadian president of the Canadian Medical Association, trying to get Canada back on track with providing rural medicine and reaching out to our small communities. No Starbucks, no McDonald's, no traffic lights, so we don't sit in gridlock for 3 hours a day to get to work. The amenities in our small community of Port McNeill were built from the people. It was a collaborative effort, but with the money and the help from the logging communities and the companies that were there. An ice arena, a community hall, a scout hall were all built with efforts from the community and the logging companies. As I said, I grew up in Burnaby, and Burnaby Central is where I graduated, and Ashley went to school with a number of very astounding good athletes. And in 1982 in Port McNeill, with the help of community and logging companies, they built a rubberized track and field area. State of the art. Only 2 of them in BC at that time. And as I said, Burnaby Central didn't have one here in Burnaby. So what's changed from that time? I'm really happy. We now have forest companies that are huge corporations with boards that are on Bay Street and Vancouver that don't have offices in my community. They don't have a commitment to my community. They don't pay huge taxes to my community. They don't help retain and build and rebuild the infrastructure that our municipalities and the dollars put there to keep stable workforce in small community. And trust me, we are the economic drivers of this province. BC is rich in resources, and we don't see the benefits of those resources stay in small communities. Like the resources, the communities are not just bleeding dollars, they're bleeding people. And they're bleeding them to the city because we can't get the services in small communities. We have a government that has taken the money and the wealth, and it has focused it on the wealthy and those that are connected. The government policies of shipping raw logs and all the resources have totally impoverished small resource communities. We did ship raw logs out in the 90s. They were superfluous to our needs at that time. In the last 10 years in this province, 150 mills have been closed. And in the last 10 years, there are 50 fewer jobs per tree than 10 years ago. So that log that goes on a logging truck and leaves Port McNeill, it's not just going to a barge and shipping over to China. It's staying on a truck and it's going over the border to a mill in Blaine. We're providing work for people that don't pay taxes in this community and in this country and in this province. An hour from my community lives a place called Port Alice. That community hasn't seen work in 2 years. The mill, which has been there for a very long time, was sold to a Chinese company. They negotiated just a year ago 25% reduction of their taxes and a 10% reduction for wages and benefits for their workforce. For those of you that work in unions and actually understand that, my husband worked for RWU for years, that would be called a closure agreement. That's just a way to tell people, yeah, we've got a current agreement and we're ready to sell the company. So what commitment does that company have to the town of Port Alice? So we need a government that invests in our small resource communities. We need that to fuel all of British Columbia. I was asked recently on a cold call from CKNW what I thought about the jobs plan. Shirley Bond had just a spectacular media production, glossy about how successful it was. I just about came unglued because it's not been successful in my community. And I trust it hasn't been in many small communities across this province. We're looking at 20 and 30% unemployment rates. People are leaving small communities to come to the city, but they can't afford the lifestyle. The community college system that was brought in the 70s by a very progressive government has also been gutted. And my concern is this was the vehicle to retrain people. We all understand diversification and the need to bring other jobs and other opportunities to our communities. But this province has also gutted that opportunity to retrain people. I work at North Island College. That's actually what pays the mortgage. And I teach English. North Island College had 4 main campuses: Port Hardy, Campbell River, Courtenay, and Port Alberni. It also had 24 learning centers. It has 1 in Ucluelet. It's considered the poster child. It's where they put the big show of the beach, and you can learn here. But the fact is the money that has been put into post-secondary education has been put into empty buildings without programming, or it's been put into an $83 million budget for our presidents and our vice presidents of our publicly funded institutions. So our children not only have to leave because there isn't a good family supporting job, they leave and they come to institutions in the cities, and they're on your wait lists. That's where your wait lists are from, a good portion of them, because we can't get programming in the north, in North Island. A prime example, just in College of New Caledonia, had a dental hygienist program, and the college decided to put it into, just to suspend it for a year. That's a new word for, we're going to close the program for a year, come back and charge 30% more for tuition. So tuition that was $7,000 is now over $25,000 for that same program. So what needs to change? For a resource community like mine that relies on forestry, and the Port McNeill area north of Campbell River is the 2nd largest forestry area in the province, next to Prince George. So we grow trees. It's actually a rainforest. But the forest policy tables that need to include municipal leaders. You need to include leaders from the communities where those resources are. We need to include First Nations. I sat on a panel that had the chief forester of the province was talking to mayors on northern Vancouver Island, telling us that they talk to First Nations, but they don't get us together at the same time. And I wonder why. Okay. And she said her think tank were 7 foresters across the province, most who belong to our large forest industries. And so there isn't that connection to community. What we need is good oversight, good government oversight of the practices to ensure we keep and sustain our forestry. It is the only sustainable resource we actually have. And in a lot of places we do a good job, and we need to keep doing that. But we also need to provide and keep good resource industry and family supporting jobs in small communities. We have affordable houses. A lot of the housing crunch here could be helped by offering those jobs in communities that people can go out to and live. I've been there for 40 years, a great place to raise a family. And we need to ensure the resource communities receive a dividend, a royalty, or better yet, allow them to open up another community forest so they actually see the benefits come right into their community. And so what I'm asking you to do, as Derrick said, as all of us as a group, we need to collectively think about who is looking after us, who looks after our community. From a ground level, if I'm trying to bring services and good jobs for my community, I need a government that respects that the resources need to stay at home before they're spending dollars overseas for jobs there. Thanks.
Thank you, Shirley. That was great. Getting good things there, Dan. Adrienne Smith for the wrap-up.
Good morning. Thanks for being here. I'd also like to acknowledge the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people and apologize to you for standing between you and your lunch. I will try to be brief and interesting. I've been asked to come and talk to you about fentanyl sentencing. I'm a human rights, criminal justice, and constitutional lawyer, and I live and work in the downtown east side. I'm sure you have all heard about fentanyl. It is a synthetic opiate that has legitimate medical applications. It's used for field trauma in military applications, for traumatic amputation, and it's used for terminal cancer pain. Usually administered through either a lollipop that transmits the drug through the tissue in the cheek or as a transdermal patch. But what's new about fentanyl is having it available as a powder and having it in the black market drug supply. You have also, I'm sure, seen the headlines, and you know that 922 people died last year. That rate is increasing. We have calculated that about a person dies of a preventable fentanyl overdose every 5 hours. So think about how many people we've lost as you've been sitting in this conference this weekend. And one of the solutions that government has come up with, and that the courts particularly recently have affirmed, is tougher sentencing for fentanyl trafficking. And the case that came out recently is the case of Frank Smith. It was issued a couple of weeks ago by the BC Court of Appeal. And let me tell you about Frank Smith. Frank is a 59-year-old Yukon man from Carcross. In 1983, he suffered a traumatic injury to his knee, and he was prescribed lawfully Tylenol 3s, to which he developed a dependency. And he was arrested in the downtown east side for selling what he believed to be heroin to a man who turned out to be an undercover police officer. And he told the court that he was involved in the drug trade in order to support his Tylenol 3 dependency. What he had turned out to be fentanyl. And he didn't know that he had fentanyl, but the Crown wanted to throw the book at him. The trial judge decided an appropriate sentence for him would be 6 months in jail. And the Crown appealed. The BC Court of Appeal decided they were not going to displace the 6 months for him, but for other fentanyl traffickers, they are going to impose a sentencing range of between 12 and 36 months. And in order to understand what this means, I need to tell you something about the principles of sentencing in Canadian law. It's a fundamental principle of Canadian criminal sentencing that the punishment needs to fit the crime, and the judge considers the consequences of the offender and of the offense, the circumstances of the offense, and comes up with something that's going to meet the needs of that offender and of society. So it's not true that there's just a grid, you do this time, you get that sentence. It's a more tailored process. And there's two principles of proportionality involved in this. These are set out in section 718 of the Criminal Code for you folks who are very keen to go look it up. And 5 or 6 principles are set out. One of these is denunciation and deterrence, but another one is rehabilitation. And the proportionality means that the sentence an offender gets has to relate to the crime, but it also has to be similar to the sentences that other people in similar situations are getting for similar crimes, so judges know what to do. and that's what a sentencing range is for. It gives general guidance for the range of a punishment someone will get for trafficking in fentanyl. And I think Frank Smith's case is illuminating because it shows us something fundamental about the structure of the drug trade. And it's tempting to think about drug dealers as bad guys and criminals, and drug users as victims who need to be helped and protected with long sentencing. But it's much more complicated than that. Frank Smith is a good example, and he's kind of emblematic of what I've learned about my work in the downtown east side, which is that most frontline drug traffickers are themselves drug users, and they're paid for their time dealing drugs in the drug to which they're addicted. So Frank Smith told the court he was addicted to codeine and Tylenol 3s, and he was dealing in order to support that dependency. And here's why this isn't going to work. This is why throwing the book at people and locking them up is not helpful. First of all, because of the structure of the drug trade, Frank Smith goes to jail forever, someone comes and takes his place. And it's not going to stop the fact that there is a black market trade in illicit drugs, because there's a nearly inexhaustible new supply of frontline drug dealers. We're going to solve this problem not with supply side tough on crime Harper style initiatives. We're going to solve this problem with demand side healthcare solutions, because this is a healthcare issue that needs to be met with healthcare solutions. If simply locking people up and being mean to drug dealers was going to affect the drug trade at all, these things have been banned for 100 years, and as a society, we are particularly nasty to drug users. And it hasn't solved this complicated social problem. We're not going to arrest our way out of the fentanyl epidemic. We also know that time in jail doesn't rehabilitate people. There are no culturally appropriate services for a lot of my clients who tend to be Indigenous or transgender in jail. But what programs are available tend to be 12 steps, which don't have a lasting impact. What is required is medically supported opiate substitution treatments like methadone, Suboxone, but also prescription heroin and prescription hydromorphone, particularly in jail. And when we discharge people from jail, where we know that their tolerance to these opiates declines tremendously, we need to discharge them with naloxone, which is a drug which reverses opiate addiction. I feel like I should also tell you something about what cities and municipalities and small towns in BC can do, because this isn't just a Vancouver issue, this isn't just a Surrey-Whalley issue, this isn't just a Maple Ridge or an Abbotsford issue, although it's certainly real in those places. The issue before us is that the black market drug supply is tainted with fentanyl, and fentanyl is killing people. And what is even more serious about it is that it's not just the opiate drug supply, things like heroin and morphine, that is contaminated. We're finding these drugs in what people who are stimulant users are expecting to be cocaine or crystal methamphetamine, MDMA, when these folks are not equipped or trained or familiar with what an opiate overdose looks like. And we're seeing it now in outside of a population of really addicted people. We're seeing this popping up in recreational drugs. So it's an issue for all of us in all of the communities across Canada. And what you should do, getting swiftly to what you should do, is not rely on tough on crime initiatives to work out what is essentially a health problem. We need a sharps box in every bathroom in any of the facilities that you operate. We need the front desk person to be trained in naloxone, but we also need to make our cities safer for people who use drugs so their lives can stabilize and they can get themselves to a place when they might be ready to stop. And while we're doing that, we need to tell senior levels of government that they need to also take responsibility for this issue, because it's municipalities and cities which are funding fire response and police response. And I think you can guess my view on how effective it is for police to attend to the scene of an overdose. I think if they're administering Narcan, fantastic. But community dollars for additional policing is not going to keep people alive. Community funds to healthcare initiatives like first responders, some of these frontline folks who are working in supportive housing and certainly in fire service are really at the front line. of dealing with this issue. And I'm seeing some frowns in the room, and I think that's cool, because what I'm saying is a little bit radical. But you shouldn't attribute more money to community policing, because it's not going to help. You should attribute more money to overdose response. I don't want to call these overdose prevention sites, because that's not what they're doing. They're preventing death. They're treating the overdose as a kind of a given, and that's not true. These 1,000 people who have died in British Columbia in the last year and a bit, these deaths are preventable. While I was thinking about what I was going to say to you today, 5 ambulances drove by my window, and each one of those correlates to a neighbor of mine who might not have made it. And these are incredibly preventable. We need to stop criminalizing the drug supply. We need to connect people with uncontaminated drugs. And we need social services which are going to keep them alive and get them better. I had clients who participated in the prescription heroin trial in the downtown east side, and you know what happened? They got better. Some of them are working now. Some of them have connected with long-lost children they had never seen before. They got health care for some of their other chronic conditions like hepatitis C and HIV because they were stable enough to get these things treated, and their likelihood of committing crimes reduced substantially. We know what to do. We have a solution for these things. The evidence is very, very clear. And it's not going to come through community policing. It's going to come through healthcare initiatives. So thank you for being local politicians. You actually have an incredible amount of power to meet this issue on the ground and to speak up. And thanks for your attention today.
Okay, I just want to thank this panel for raising some They have raised for us some incredibly interesting systemic issues. They have demonstrated, I think, through their words and their stories, the importance of persistence, of continuing to challenge, of continuing to push the envelope. And they've probably given us some food for thought about other things you might want to keep in mind as you're going about your business at the board and council tables. You'll have a deeper understanding, perhaps, of some of the systemic challenges ahead. I wish it wasn't April Fool's Day. I wish we could go, ting, these issues don't exist, but they do. And I want to thank these people very, very much for their leadership.